Hello, everyone, and welcome to this PractiTest series webinar. My name is Joel, and I'm Practice Chief Solution Architect, and I want to welcome you today's webinar on mixing test types in order to optimize your testing results. So before we get started, I want to thank Edit, PractiTest Customer Success Manager, for actually being my wingman on today's session. And guys, up front, if anyone has any questions at any time now or at any other point, please let us know using the chat, and we will obviously go over that. We have a Q&A section at the end, and so we will go over all those questions that you have towards the end. Now, also to let you know, we will be recording this webinar, and it will be sent to everyone who subscribed to it. I think about tomorrow, something like that. Okay. So first of all, what do we want to cover on today's session? So wait a second, let me just make sure that we're live here. So what do we want to cover on today's webinar? Basically, we want to go over the next point. We want to start by going over the question of why do we need different testing types when we're actually doing our testing research? And this is a question that some people don't ask themselves, and so I want to go over this for a couple seconds. Then I want to review some common testing type classifications. Okay, so why do we look at them this way or that way, how some people in the market are actually doing it. And I want to be clear, we're not going to go over every classification. There are plenty of them. So just want to name the most that are more important, at least from my perspective. Then we'll go over some of those types a little bit more in depth, and how do you make something more practical by using testing types, and how do you mix them in order to get better results. And as always, at the end of the session, we will be going over a Q&A section. So you don't need to wait for the end. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask them, and we'll take them on the end. And again, we will answer all those questions. So before we get started, as I said, I'm Chief Solution Architect at PractiTest, and we're sponsoring this webinar. So just very briefly about us. Practice, it's a SaaS ALM solution. ALM stands for Application Lifecycle Management, and it's basically what you know as a QA management system or a test management solution. We make sure to make a very intuitive and simple solution, but also a very methodological and flexible one. So if you're looking for the tool that will help you to, again, lead your process on a very effective way without having too much of an overhead, you should go ahead and take a look into us. And again, very quickly, we integrate with lots of other tools, and something that we're very, very proud of. We have the best support in the business. And if you doubt it, just make sure to contact us, and we'll be more than happy to show you how we actually do it over here. But back to our webinar and back to testing types. And before we even start, I want to do a show of hands. And again, as part of your GoToMeeting controls, you have the way of raising your hand. So what I want to do right now is to do a very quick show of hands. And I want to ask all of you, or how many of you actually consciously use different testing types as part of your work? Okay, so if you can just, again, do a show of hands, just raise your hand as part of your GoToWebinar, and I will be able to see how many people actually do it. So again, going very briefly over that. Okay, I'm going to give a couple more seconds. Again, the question, how many of you actually consciously think, okay, I'm going to use this test type and that test type when I'm actually doing my work? Okay, guys, this is actually very interesting. If I look over the people on the webinar, I think it's about a quarter of the people in the webinar are actually doing this. So only about a quarter of you are currently using different testing types as part of your work. And I have a surprise for you. I actually think that it's closer to 100% of you, because all of us use different test types when we actually go over our works. But the interesting thing is that not many of us actually realize that we do it, and even less of us make a conscious decision before we start testing, when we're doing the test plan, in order to use different testing types, and so make better testing coverage of the way that we're using. And so this is what we want to do today. I just want to make sure, again, get a type of feeling here. Now, once we put that on the sideline, let's move forward, and let's actually start with the topic. So first of them is, why do we need different test types? Okay, why can't we only work with one test type? Meaning, how come testing is so complex that we need different testing types? And in order to go over this question, I want to do a very short exercise with you guys. Okay, again, trust me, it's not very long, it's not very weird, but it will help us actually to understand why do we need multiple testing types. So what I want you to do, again, it's going to take a minute, but I want you to close your eyes for the next minute, and I want you to imagine the following professionals. I'm going to give you a profession or one person of a profession, and I want you to imagine this person, again, in your mind. And I want to start by imagining a doctor. Okay, I want you to go ahead and imagine a doctor, a medical doctor, obviously. Think about where are you meeting this person. Think about how does he or she looks like. What is she doing? With what is she doing that? Meaning, how is she? If she's working, then how is she working on that? Okay, I try to imagine that doctor very, very firmly. Now, let's go to another profession. And what I want you to imagine right now, it's a woods craftsman. Okay, and I want you to imagine that person, not a carpenter. We're looking at that guy who's actually an artist, who's taking that piece of wood and making it into that piece of furniture that it's more artistic than functional, maybe. What is this person doing? How does he look? What is he using in order to do his work? Okay, I want you to try to imagine that. And finally, I want you to try to imagine a soldier. Okay, and maybe go back to your childhood or go back to that Hollywood movie you saw a couple of months ago. Try to imagine that soldier. Okay, where is he? What is this person doing? Okay, what is he using? I want you to think about that person and try to imagine how does he look at this point. Now, let's look into all three of these people here. And let's try to understand, okay, so all of these are different professionals. We're looking at a doctor professional, not at any doctor. We're looking at a professional wood craftsman, and we're looking also at a professional soldier, that guy who's closer to Rambo or Chuck Norris than Private Ryan, if you want. But what do they have in common? If we look into what do they have in common, then, and again, very briefly, you will see that what draws them in common, and also in your image that you were having, is that these people are actually people displaying knowledge. When you look at them working, then you know, hey, this person actually knows what he's doing. This person also has experience about what he's doing. But if you imagine it right, then you also saw that this person has the correct tools for what he was doing. And if it's a doctor, then he has a stethoscope, or you were seeing it in an examination or with a needle or something like that. And obviously a woods craftsman, you saw him working the wood. And a soldier, many people see him in the middle of a fight, either shooting something or doing like that. Everyone will have the knowledge, the experience, and the tools. And basically, this is why this is what we want to experience. And this is also why do we need so many different tools when we're actually doing testing. That's why we need different types of tests. If you look into this image here, then it's only to explain. This is how a woods craftsman garage would look like. And notice that he doesn't have one hammer. He has plenty of those. He doesn't have one screwdriver. He has plenty of those. He will also have stuff like string and glue and all sorts of stuff that we wouldn't even imagine that he will need. But fact of the matter is that this person will need it because he's an expert woods craftsman, and he knows that he will need different tools in order to do different parts of his job. And it's exactly the same when we look into our jobs as testers. We cannot think that we will use the same test type or the same test approach and try to apply it to all the things that we need to cover with our testing. We will need to, in the same way that we will even need different types of hammers and different types of screwdrivers, we will need also different types of tests when we do it, okay? And some of them are closely related, some of them are completely differently apart. We will actually start reviewing them very closely. Now, if we look into this, and again, we see that we have different categories of tools, and it's going to be something similar when we go over categorization of test cases within testing, okay? Now, many people will classify their testing in different ways. And what I try to do is basically to bring forward some of the most common testing classifications that we have in there. And again, we will go in more detail a little bit later on. But if we look into how we classify our tests, then we see that some people tend to classify them based on something very trivial, like on what phase of my project am I going to use different types of tests. Other people may actually go and say, hey, I'm going to classify my testing based on the understanding of the code that I have it when I'm performing that test. And I will go into more details shortly. Some people try to classify their test cases based on the flexibility or the rigidity of the test. Okay, how much do I need to stick to my script, and how much should I actually go ahead and explore what I need to go ahead and do? Some of us might want to go and classify our test cases based on the tools that we're going to be using for them. Okay, and here I'm talking about more specific tools. Okay, if we need scripting tools or stuff like that. And some people will actually go ahead and classify the test cases that we're doing based on the attributes of the software or the product that we're trying to go over them. Okay, and again, this is only a handful of ways of classifying, and there's obviously more of those. But it's going to be important for us to look into these classifications, and maybe if you have your own classifications, it's also okay. But it's important to have these classifications, and we'll see later on why it's important to have them. But what I want to do right now is actually to go over these examples that I have here and provide you with some of the definitions that we have of the different types of test cases that we might be using during our projects. Okay, and I will start from the first one that we have here, and this is the classification of test types based on the phase of the project that we're going to be working on. And this is maybe the one that is most commonly known, and it's also one of the older ones. And it's the people who are going to say, okay, so I'm going to classify my test cases based on whether they're unit tests, integration tests, system tests, or acceptance tests. And if you look closely, obviously this is the testing module that originated with the V development module. And you might have seen it as part of the V module or the W module. Obviously they use both the same module. So this is a relatively old type of classification. But one of the things that people don't realize is that even though we generated this type of testing on the V module, it's still very valuable and very relevant today, even when we're working on agile approaches, or when we're working on iterative development, or again, even on DevOps. Looking at test cases in this way, it's still very valuable for many of us. And the reason for that is because when we look into our test cases and we try to classify based on unit integration, acceptance, and test, then we're actually looking into how do we build up the product. Okay, just a reminder, unit tests are going to be the test cases that go over the specific functions that we're working, input in, input out. Integration test is going to be the test cases that actually look into those units and how they interact one another without looking too much into the functionality. The system test is when we look into the test cases and we try to work what we call many times end-to-end scenarios. We're looking at the system as a whole, not so much at the units. An acceptance test is looking at the system from the point of view of our users, of our end users. Okay, so the value of cataloging these our test cases based on this categorization is that it helps us to focus on specific places. We spotlight specific parts of the software and the integrations of the software that we want to do. And sometimes it's the easiest way that we have of building the testing of our products. Okay, so regardless if you're doing unit agile testing or more waterfall testing, is going to be still valuable. So take that into account. Now, the second type of classification that we have, it might sound weird, but it's classification based on the understanding of the code. Okay, and what I mean by this, it's basically when we try to classify our test cases based on black box testing or white box testing. Okay, so just a reminder, when we talk about black box testing, is the testing that is done without knowing anything about the code that I'm testing. So I'm not looking into the functions, I'm not looking into the structure of the code. I'm going to be testing based on the functionality and not thinking about any way how my system was written. On the other hand, white box testing is done when we understand the code fully. We know all the features, we know all the statements that we have in the code, we know the structure of our program, and obviously these will help us to understand, okay, which are the more problematic points, but it will also have some drawbacks. Now, something that came up some years ago, it's people were at the beginning, they were saying, okay, so you either work black box or white box. But truth of the matter is that most testing done by QA professional falls under the category of gray box. And what's gray box? Well, I think that most testers do understand how the product is formed. They know what structure the product has, but they might not be very knowledgeable on the actual functions and the actual statements of their code. So they have some knowledge, but not a lot of knowledge. So this is what we call gray box. And if you think about it, most of us, when we're testing professionals, this is the way that we're doing our test cases. Now, why is it important to look into black box, white box, and gray box? Well, basically, and as I started saying before, when you know the structure of your code, when you know the weak spots of your code, it will be easier to go and attack those weak spots. Okay, so obviously, if I know where my system is vulnerable, I will start by going over those places. But on the other hand, there's also a drawback of sticking to the known paths. Okay, so if I know that these are the problematic points, then I won't test in other places, and maybe those bugs are going to be hidden on those places. And that is why sometimes it's very helpful to test on a white box approach, knowing exactly where I want to go. But it's also valuable to say, hey, I'm going to give the product to someone who doesn't know anything about the code, and let's actually let him go ahead and test the product without knowing. And let's see if they find something else, something interesting that we might have missed. Okay, so that's also why it's important to use both of these types of test cases. Now, moving over, I want to go over the next classification type. And here I want to go over something that actually named based on the rigidity of the test cases that we're working. Now, I mentioned some of it before, but here I'm talking about the difference between test cases that are more scripted versus more context-driven. And what we need to know is that we're talking here about a prism. We're talking here about a continuum that goes from test cases, or you know what, let's actually go and define this. I think it might be easier for people to understand if you're not familiar with the concept. But when we talk about scripted test cases, these are test cases that are based on the written scripts and the written steps that we have. So if you have a system, for example, like PractiTest, where you go ahead and write your test cases and you have your steps and it's like do this and expect that, do that and expect that. So this is what we call a script or a test script or a scripted test case, okay? We write these steps and we write the expected results. Now, at the other side of this spectrum, we actually have what is called the content-driven school or content-driven test cases. And these are test cases that the formal definition is test cases where you're actually learning the system, planning and running your test cases as you actually start learning that system by itself. So it's basically what is called exploratory test cases. And these are test cases where you don't really have a script. You start working with the system, you start learning how the system works. And as you learn how the system works, you basically test it in by itself, okay? Now, I don't want to go over the very big discussion there's on the testing community of context-driven school versus scripted-driven school. Basically, I believe that there's room for both of them. And this is actually the value of it, okay? So personally speaking, I like mixing both of these testing approaches. I do believe that when you have someone who's very experienced on the tool that you're testing, someone who has a lot of experience in testing, then this person might want to go over the context-driven approach, and he actually might do it very, very well. But on the other hand, if you have someone who doesn't have a lot of experience in testing, doesn't know how to look for those bugs, doesn't know any testing heuristics, or it's not very familiar with the system in by itself, then you may want to go on a more scripted approach, okay? And the truth is that you will want to have a blend of both of these approaches. Now, one of the things that's important to understand, and this is something that I've seen a lot of times when people talk about context-driven test cases. When we talk about context-driven test cases, it's very easy for people to say, hey, context-driven tests are only exploratory test cases. This is not the case, okay? There are plenty of different examples of context-driven types of test cases. And yes, the first one is what it's called exploratory testing, and you can read about it quite a lot on the internet. And if you want to send me an email, I'll send you a lot of information about it. But this is basically that test case where they tell you, okay, so go ahead and test this product. And you learn the product and start testing it as you actually go along on the process. Okay, you don't have your steps, you write them down, you do document your test cases, and you document what you've done, but you actually don't have anything written up front. You actually do it as you're testing along. So this is only one of the examples. There's another type of test case of context-driven test. Well, this is more of context-driven test management, and it's called session-based testing. Session-based testing means that you will have exploratory testing sessions. Okay, each session might be 45 minutes or an hour and a half, but for each of those sessions, you will have what is called a charter or an objective. So you will say, on this session, I want to do exploratory testing on this part of the product. In that session, I want to do exploratory testing on that part of the product. So you do have some more coverage that you're going to be able to do, but you're still within the context-driven part of testing. Now, you also have something that is called bug hunts that fall under context-driven school. bug hunts are pair testing or team testing approaches. Pair testing means two people testing together, where you're basically saying to this pair of people or to this group of people, go ahead and find bugs in the products. Okay, so they start coming up with ideas. Hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. They're trying on purpose to fail the system in order to find those bugs that you want to go ahead then and actually take out of the system, obviously. And again, only another example of context-driven test cases. You have plenty of those as well. It's what is called soap opera. Oops, sorry. We went a little bit over. Okay. The other one is what is called soap opera scenarios. And again, I've used this a couple times in the past. It's actually very nice. You basically give people roles, okay? And you give people roles in front of the application and say, go ahead and do a soap opera scenario. Imagine that you're user of type A, and another person is user of type B, and start interacting one another, but doing in an exaggerated fashion, okay? So start making a lot of functions, start doing a lot of operations with the system. Try to do it exaggeratedly, and that will help you out to find those bugs that might be harder to find if you do it on a more simple approach if you want. Okay, so again, all of these are types of context-driven tests so that you don't think that context-driven school is only exploratory testing. Now, the next type of testing, it's based on the tools we used. Okay, and here we're talking about the classification between manual testing and test automation or automated testing. Now, it's important to understand, there's not only one type of manual testing versus automated testing, there's plenty of those. And it's also very important to understand that even though there are tons of value on automating, not every test that you're going to be testing should or will be automated, okay? Some people say, hey, automation is actually advancing more and more, testing as a manual profession is dead. And that's not the case. There's a lot of test cases. There's a lot of, meaning checking. When you're trying to verify that statements actually happen, it might be easy to do it with automation, but when you're trying to do more manual verification and understanding the product, it will be harder for you to do it automatically. Okay, so these are the kind of things to understand. Another thing that it's important to understand is that there are plenty of types of automation, okay? Some people say, hey, automation is only functional automation or Selenium or QTP or those systems out there. Some people go a step forwards and say, hey, we have functional automation. We also have load and stress testing. But there are plenty of other types of automation. Just to name a few, you have API testing. You have data creation, and that's when you're actually creating your databases and you're creating those scenarios that you will need in order to run your test cases correctly. You have environment setups, as the QA team is actually more and more in charge of setting up the environments, and this is also part of the automation that you're going to be doing. Okay, so there are plenty of things that you may end up doing as part of your automation. Now, moving forwards, there's also testing based on the attributes that you're going to be testing. And here we basically differentiate between two types of tests. We differentiate between what we call functional tests and non-functional tests. Okay? Functional tests are those that are going to be checking the regular user interactions of the system. This is going to be going over the functionality, the main functionality, and saying, okay, so let's do this, let's do that, let's go over all the different scenarios, and let's actually review them. When we talk about non-functional systems, we're actually trying to concentrate on all the other attributes, on all the other things that your software should do and should actually comply with. Okay, and there are tons of things that your software should do that it's usually not part of the requirements, or it's part of the requirements of only seldom mentioned, but still, if you're not going to be testing that and you're not going to be having that attributes or functionality, then people are going to start screaming at you. Okay, and these are very, very interesting test cases. Now, the value here of concentrating on both types of test cases is, as I said, you want to also make sure that you're reviewing and concentrating on those non-regular functional parts of your test cases. And just to mention a couple of them, again, I was looking earlier on a list of non-functional test cases, and I saw someone who had a list of about 50 different non-functional testing types. I think that there were some repeats, but still, we had here some information that's also very valuable, just to go over them. You have usability testing. Usability testing, it's not related to the functionality. It's related on how can a user actually work with the system, how easy it is to work with it, how intuitive it is. Okay, all that kind of stuff that says, okay, so the functionality is there, but people are not going to be able to use it. So this is part of your opinion saying, hey, as a user, I wouldn't use this stuff. It's part of that usability testing that you're talking about. Maintainability testing, if we look into that, it's actually making sure that those people who are going to be maintaining those systems are going to be able to do it. Now, it used to be a time when there was no cloud and people were actually working on client server systems. And I remember we actually did a lot of test cases to make sure that people, again, the people that were selling the software could install the database or maintain those databases and back them up and upgrade them if they had service packs, how it would work. So that's very important. But even when we talk about cloud-based systems, it's very important to test maintainability, to make sure that, hey, if we need to release a patch or a service pack, can we do it quickly? Do we need to bring down the server? What other things do we need to do in there? So maintainability, it's not less important, sometimes even more important, because if your system cannot be maintained easily, then you're not going to be bringing 200 people, you might be bringing 200 million people because your whole system is going to be down for 15 minutes. Okay, so it's going to be a lot of time. Again, another type of system is compatibility testing. Compatibility testing means whether our system can work with all sorts of other systems. So if we have APIs, if we have other systems that we need to interact, if our system actually needs to take out data and then import it to another system. So that's also part of what we need to cover. Compliance. Okay, so if you need to work with people who need to work with the FDA, or if you need to work with, for example, people with disabilities. So are you compliant with all those tools or all those regulations that have to do with compliance testing? And for example, there was time, I think still today, if you want to sell to the US government, your system needs to be compliant with what is called 508 compliancy for people with disabilities. And again, there's a lot of checklists that you need to go over in order to make sure that your system actually complies with that. Next in the list, a very big topic, security testing. And again, security testing can be broken down into plenty of things, but also something that needs to be taken into account. Something that sometimes people take as part of maintainability testing is recovery testing. Okay, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if your server restarts, or you need to reboot your database? Or what happens if, I don't know, everything actually falls down? Will it take 3 hours in order to be online? Will it take 5 minutes? So all of that recovery testing, if you need to take a backup and restore that backup into your server, how do you do it? Can you do it? Many times people think, yes, you can do it, but fact of the matter is you have a backup that you cannot restore. So those are the type of test cases you need to go over. Obviously, one that I like very much, install and install. People tend not to look into that and say, hey, install is something that people do once with the product, but they forget to notice that people do it the first time that they actually are interacting with the product. So if your installation doesn't work, nothing else will matter, okay? Same goes for uninstall. Many times we need to uninstall the product. And if, again, I remember back when we used to work with Windows 95 and stuff like that, uninstalling something used to leave a lot of garbage on the system. And so again, in my company, we made a lot of efforts to make sure that whenever you uninstall something, everything goes out. Okay, so these are things that might be important because they will have a repercussion later on. I mentioned, I think, operator testing when we did a little bit of maintainability. Also accessibility, I mentioned that. Now, portability, it's a very nice testing and something that people don't usually do. Hey, is your system able to work both on a browser and on a tablet? Can you port it over to your iPhone or to your Nexus phone? So those are the type of tests that are taking a lot of efforts right now, and people don't really know that they're doing it. But it's actually called portability testing. Very important. And again, 10 points to whoever understands what I wrote in here. I'm going to give you 2 seconds. Come on, guys. Can someone tell me what's written in there? Okay, hopefully someone did. I'm not looking into there. But I-18N means internationalization testing. Internationalization testing means that how is your system going to work when you're working on an operating system with other languages? For example, we're in Israel, so we need to test with Hebrew. But what happens if you're in China? What happens if you're in Latin America and you're using all those accents and stuff like that? Or if you're using umlauts in Germany? I mean, will your system know how to write from right to left and left to right also? So all of those testings are very important. And I remember, again, working in companies in the past where we have a lot of flunks on that place. And again, also something that is called volume testing that I like to separate very much from load testing. Volume testing is how your system will react when you have tons of data. Will you be able to log into your system? Will it take 5 minutes to just log in because you have a lot of queries to run in your database? How fast will it be? Will it be affected at all? Okay, so all of these are things that you need to take into account whenever you're actually working on the system, because usually when you talk with a product marketing manager and you bring out a list like this, they will say, yes, you need to test all of this, but the problem is that no one actually thought about them when they were putting together the requirements for the feature, right? So this is something that we need to bring forward in here. Okay, so we looked into how to classify our test cases, and let's say that we have a very big library of test cases in there. But okay, so other than knowing all that stuff and maybe going into your certification exam, what do you want to do with that? And what I want you to do with that is basically, I want us to go back to the world that we have at the beginning with all the tools that we had in there, okay? And what you see here, it's something that brings me back to my childhood. I think it was back in the 80s and 90s. I used to be in the Scouts. I used to live in Costa Rica. And I was on a Scout movement in Costa Rica, and I wasn't with the group of people who we had all the tools, and we were the technical team, and we had all the tents that we needed to put together and the electricity and stuff like that. And our wall looked exactly like this, and we had drawings for everything that we had in there. And the reason we had the drawing was, first of all, obviously, so that we could put everything in its place once we were done with that. But more importantly than that, it was so that if something was missing, we actually would see very easily that A, something was missing, and B, what is it that was missing from there, okay? So this is what I want you to do. Actually, once you step out of this session, I think that you should go ahead over the points that we have talked about. And I think that you should mark out which are those tools that are relevant to you, to your project, maybe not relevant to this specific project, but this to your product in general. And I think that you should make that list and cover it. And once you have that in place, the next step is actually to go back and make sure that you implement that as part of your master test plan. And I do apologize for people who were not in our last webinar. The webinar last month was about the MTP, or the master test plan, or how to plan your testing approach. And if you were not in that webinar, let us know. We can send you that presentation if you want. But if you remember at the end of that webinar, I mentioned of the MTP as a document and the planning of the project that you had in there. And I wanted to focus here on which of these places are those test types important, okay? And if you remember this, and remember these are the parts of my MTP, and again, yours might be different or should be different. And for me, thinking about test types is incredibly important when you think about the testing scope. And remember, testing scope is when I say, okay, so this feature I'm going to be testing that way, and that feature I'm going to be testing that way. And these are the things that I need to test as part of my project. So when I think about the testing scope, I will be thinking about all the different type of test cases that I want to run, all the different functionalities, all the different attributes that I want to run in there. Okay, and I want to make sure that it's covered in here. And I want to make sure that it's covered in here. And it's also going to be covered on my software and hardware requirements. Because if we mention that, again, sometimes we will need data, sometimes we will need different types of servers. If we need to do recovery testing and stuff like that, then we will need at least multiple machines, or maybe to have more environments on Amazon in order to be able to do it. So this is also a place where those different types of tests should actually come in place. The other place, obviously, is going to be preparations. So if you need to prepare upfront, if you need to have, again, environments, or it can be automation, or it can be, if you need to go ahead and learn about all the different types of compatibility that you need to have. So those are things that you need to do as part of your preparations. And obviously, and this is one of the most trivial ones, you need to put them as part of your tasks and schedules. Because as I said, when people put together the requirements for the system, then maybe they put that, well, you need to install it, but they don't think that you need to be able to upgrade. And how do you need to upgrade? And from where to where do you need to upgrade? Or if you need to do, again, compatibility tests and stuff like that, you need to be able to put it as part of your task and to make sure that people understand that there's a cost to having all of these type of test cases. And so if someone says, hey, you should not incur into that cost because it's not important to us, make sure that it's going to be in there, okay? So again, the idea of thinking about the different types of test cases that we can work with. It's not only for the theoretical basis. It's not also something that someone just throws at you a feature and says, hey, Joel, go ahead and test this feature right now because we work agile. You need to think about it and say, okay, so what do I need to think here? And for that, it's going to be easier if you have a set of test cases that you say, okay, so these are the tools that I could use. Which are the ones that are useful? Maybe today I'm going to use only the hammer and the pliers because these are not relevant. But at least make that conscious decision saying that these tools in here are not going to be relevant for you and you're going to be concentrating only on those ones. And the only way that you will be able to do that is if you know upfront which are the tools that actually are at your disposal. Okay? Now, guys, I think that I talked quite enough. So I want to go into that fun part of the session, and I want to go over the questions that you have been sending up front. So I'm going to go over them as well. Again, guys, if you have questions, continue asking them. Now, Edith's actually going over the questions, and I'm going to answer them. Going try to answer them very quickly. The first one's very easy to answer. Someone is asking if we can send a recording of this, and I mentioned that before. We are recording the session. We will send them to everyone who signed into the session, who actually signed into the webinar, even if you're not part of the webinar. I think that by tomorrow you should have a copy of that. Again, if you don't get it by tomorrow, let us know, and we'll send to you, even though you should be able to get that. The second question that we have here, and again, we have plenty, it's more, let me just read it out. Can you explain, please, what's session-based testing and explain a little bit more about the charters? So again, I want to take you over, sorry, need my mouse to cooperate with me here. So first of all, we're talking here about the difference between scripted testing and context-driven testing, or the scripted school and the context-driven school. And again, I'm not going to go into that discussion. Just to give a background, scripted testing believes that most of the test cases should be written up front. Context-driven school says, well, it's better just to have a lot of knowledge and then test and document as we're moving along, and to make sure that we continue exploring the software as much as possible. And as part of the context-driven school, there are different types of test cases. And what this person was saying is, if I can just refer again to session-based testing. Now, guys, session-based testing is something that I like very much, and I do believe a lot in session-based testing. And it basically means the following. It means that you have testers who know how to perform exploratory testing sessions, but still, you want to make sure that you have an organized type of coverage of your software. So you want to say, okay, so we're going to be testing that functionality, we're going to be testing that functionality, we're going to be testing that other functionality. We will be doing it using exploratory testing sessions, but we still want to make sure that we went over all the different parts of the features that we have in there. Now, every single part of those objectives or charters, we're going to call charters, and I'm going to say, okay, so someone or a group of people will do an exploratory testing session on that specific charter. So basically what you do is, before you start your testing project, you define a set of charters. Okay, you will create a list of, let's say, objectives of what you want to create, and you might start with 10 or 15 objectives. And people will start running these exploratory testing sessions. At the end of every exploratory testing session, people might come up with new charters that you need to test. Obviously, as you learn the system, you understand more stuff that you need to test. So you may continue adding up more and more charters, or including different charters together. Basically, it means that you're going to be having a to-do list of different exploratory testing sessions that you want to go ahead and cover. Okay, so that's with regards to session-based testing. I think that James Bach has some incredible, I think about 2 articles that he wrote on session-based testing. So you may want to go to James Bach's Solstice website and learn more about exploratory testing from what he has in there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to edit and the additional questions. Okay, let me just go over this. There's a question here that says, how do we plan agile testing when the features under development are constantly changing? And this is what I said at the end. And you know what? Let me take you to, again, let me take you over, you know what, to this slide in here. I want you to make, to try to think of how can you organize your testing like this. Okay, how can you say, okay, so these are the type of automated test cases that I have in my power, and these are the types of manual test cases that I have in my power. And when I'm talking about exploratory testing, you usually have what is called heuristics. This might be the heuristics that I have for my exploratory testing sessions. Okay, so, and these are going to be the These are the guys who I can use for white box testing, or these are the guys who I can use for black box testing. You should have that list somewhere. And I don't mean theoretically speaking, I mean you should write it down somewhere. Okay, have a actual list of stuff that you have in there. And this is going to be very useful. Why? Because one of the things that happens a lot when you're working on an agile environment is that someone will come and say, hey, this is the new user story. Later today or tomorrow morning, you will get this user story written down and you should go ahead and test it. So go ahead and test it. Now, you're not going to be having a lot of time to plan. It's not true that you won't have any time at all to plan. Okay, you will have some time to plan. Sometimes it's 15 minutes. Sometimes it's 2 hours, but you will have some time to plan. So make sure that if you have those 2 hours, you're going to use it to plan correctly. Okay, what does it mean to plan correctly? Look into this buffet that you have here and say, okay, so I'm going to use this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy for these and these reasons. So this is how I'm going to go for my agile testing. So whenever you're going to be working agile, it doesn't mean that everything can be done abruptly. It actually means that you need to be extremely organized so that you can choose and select the stuff that you want to do at any single time. By the way, the same goes for scripted testing, because a lot of time people say that when you're working agile, then you need to have like very, let me just take you here. A lot of people think that when you're working agile, you need to work on a context-driven kind of school, and it's not correct. Meaning you can have a lot of different scripts that are going to be doing a lot of different sanity test cases for different places. And so when someone tells you, okay, so these are the things that I need to go ahead and test, so you can just fetch them over and say, I have this and this and this, and I can go ahead and just run them. Okay, so when you're working agile, you need to be more organized than before. Okay, another question here. How does an MTP, how does a master test plan help me to mix different test types? Well, plainly put, the MTP is not going to help you to do anything. Okay, again, maybe I was not understood correctly, but the MTP is not going to help you to test correctly. But once you have an MTP, and again, a master test plan can be back of the envelope, 5 lines where you're saying what you're going to be testing, and so your whole test is going to be your testing scope, and that's okay. Your master test plan might be a 150-page document going over every single point in here. The MTP is not going to help you to mix your test cases, but actually it's going to give you the opportunity of use testing mixes. Okay, so when you're doing the testing scope, say it out loud. This I'm going to be doing exploratory testing with these heuristics. This I'm going to be doing scripted testing with those test cases. These are going to be, I want them to do white box, and these I want to do black box. Even if you go over to the areas where we said that you have unit testing, integration testing, system testing, you can go ahead and say, okay, so these places is very important for us to make sure that we have good unit testing coverage. Why? Because historically speaking, we know that we have a lot of input-output errors in there, and having good unit testing is going to help us. And here we will need to do a lot of load testing. So the MTP is not going to help you to mix those test cases, but if you have a very good MTP, you will be able to take a lot of advantage on those testing mixes and make sure that they are actually reflected on your testing scope, on your requirements, on your schedule, obviously, even on your external references if you want. Okay, guys, I think that we have time for one more question. Okay, let me see one more question that we have in here. Okay, there's a question here that is an interesting one, and it goes over automation. Okay, and I'm going to go over here back to our automation slide here. And the question here is actually about something we wrote here. It says, what do you mean that not all test cases can or should be automated? Why should a test not be automated if we have the people to automate it with? Well, this is a good question. Actually, it's a question that comes that we're asked a lot of times. I mean, especially management. Management will say, "Hey, you know what? I want you to automate everything. I don't want to have a manual testing team anymore. You have a year. Go ahead and automate whatever you have in there." It may sound okay, but it's not feasible. Okay, automation is not testing. Automation is checking. With automation, you can say, okay, if I have this action that I want to make sure that it works, I can see that it works. But what happens if it works kind of, sort of? What happens if, okay, it's not about whether it works or not, it's about whether it works correctly or not. Usually what we have is that it's true that you can create a program that is going to be complex enough for you to duplicate human behavior and have like all the different criteria of how the system should behave. But if you look at it, into it, it's actually not economically feasible. Why? Because there's a lot of things that is going to be easier for your testers to just run with the system and say, hey, this actually behaves okay, this okay, this okay. As a user, I actually like this type of operation. What you need to try to do is to actually find that blend. You need to understand what do you need to automate. You need to automate those tasks that are repetitive. You need to automate those tasks that can be automated. You need to automate, for example, the sanity of your product. Is it broken completely? I don't care if it's broken on a very deep corner, but you can have a scenario that's going to be fully automated that will tell you if someone on the last build actually broke that corner of the software, then that's going to have a lot of sense on automating that. If you have something, for example, let's see that the windows of the system looks okay in every browser. Yes, you can automate that. When we're talking about more complex functionality, it's usually not economic enough for you to go ahead and automate every single part of your product. And again, you can go ahead and I can send you some blogs on that where it explains about the difference between checking and testing. Checking is making sure that something that we know that should behave that way will behave that way. But many times the bugs are not related to something that we actually thought about behaving or not behaving. It's about something that, again, comes from the corner of the screen and tells you, hey, this is wrong. And it doesn't really matter what type of automation that you're going to be running. It's not going to be able to catch that types of bugs in there. Okay, so something to understand. Even though you might be able to automate everything, it's not going to be, again, possible to have everything in automated fashion. Okay, just checking, Eddie, do we have any additional questions here? Okay, so apparently we don't have any more. So guys, again, so we are here. One last word again about PractiTest. If you have time and it's something that interests you, just get in touch with us and we'll be more than happy to provide you a lot more information about PractiTest. And we do want to thank you for taking the time for being in the session today. We're going to be sending the recording of this session to everyone that was in here. And again, if you want to send me an email, any questions that you have, just send them to joe@practice.com. And again, you can just check out our blog in practice called qablog.practice.com. I write in there a lot of stuff. Some of it was here, and again, all sorts of other different stuff. And again, if there's any additional questions, then maximum you can send them to me via email, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. So guys, thank you very much for taking the time for being on this webinar. We hope to see you again in the next webinar next month. And again, have a great day, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye, and thank you very much.